The left engine coughed once, twice, then died with a mechanical wheeze that cut through my soul like a frozen blade. Below me, the snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas rose like the teeth of some ancient beast, their jagged summits clawing at my belly as my C-46 Commando began its sickening descent towards certain death. The altimeter needle spun backward, 18,000 feet, 17,000, 16, and there wasn't a flat piece of ground for 300 miles in any direction. Just rock, ice, and the kind of cold that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. My name is Captain Jake Morrison, and I was about to become another casualty of the most dangerous supply route in World War II, theft flight they called the Hump. It was April 15, 1944, and I was flying my 73rd mission over the Himalayas, ferrying supplies from our base in Assam, India, to Kunming, China. The war in the Pacific was raging, and the only way to keep Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese forces supplied, and General Claire Chennault's flying tigers in the air, was to fly over the most treacherous mountains on Earth. The Japanese had cut off the Burma Road in 1942, leaving this aerial highway as our only lifeline to China. The morning had started like any other at Chabua airfield in northeastern India. The monsoon rains had finally stopped, leaving the runway a muddy mess that sucked at our boots as we walked through the pre-dawn darkness to our aircraft. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of jungle rot and aviation fuel. Around me, other pilots moved like ghosts in the darkness, each man knowing that statistics were against us. We were losing one aircraft for every round trip, sometimes more. Morrison, Sergeant Pete Williams, my flight engineer, jogged up to me as I approached our C-46. Weather report just came in. Clear skies over the low passes, but there's a storm system building over the high route. I looked up at our bird, serial number 43 to 47,025, which we nicknamed Iron Annie for her ability to take punishment and keep flying. She was a twin-engine transport built by Curtiss Wright, capable of carrying 5 tons of cargo at altitudes up to 25,000 feet. That altitude capability was crucial because the peaks we had to cross topped out at over 20,000 feet. There was no room for error. "What's our load today, Pete?" I asked, running my hand along the cold aluminum fuselage. 5,000 pounds of ammunition, medical supplies, and radio equipment, he replied, consulting his clipboard. Plus, we've got 3 passengers, replacement pilots heading to Kunming. I nodded grimly. Every pound mattered when you were trying to clear mountains that could tear the wings off your aircraft. The passengers were young replacement pilots, fresh from flight school, about to get their baptism by fire flying with the 14th Air Force in China. Looking at their eager faces, I remembered my own first trip over the Hump 8 months ago, the terror, the realization that I was flying through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. The briefing room was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous chatter. Major Bill Henderson, our squadron commander, stood at the front with a weather map that looked like a child's drawing of chaos. Swirling clouds, storm fronts, and wind patterns that could flip a 20-ton aircraft like a leaf. "Gentlemen," Henderson began, his voice cutting through the noise, "today's route takes us over the northern passes. Winds are variable but strong. Expect turbulence like you've never felt. The Japanese have been active lately, with 0 fighters reported near my Guiana. Stay alert, stay high, and for God's sake, stay alive." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around me, 24 pilots absorbed information with the quiet intensity of men who knew they might not see sunset. The mathematics of our mission were brutal. Since we'd started flying the Hump in 1942, we'd lost over 600 aircraft and 1,600 men. The mountains were littered with the wreckage of C-46s, C-47s, and C-54s that had tried and failed to make the crossing. "Morrison," Henderson called out as we filed out of the briefing room, "you're flying lead today. Keep the formation tight over the high passes." I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Flying lead meant 23 other aircraft would follow my navigation, trust my judgment, and rely on my experience to get them through. It was an honor and a burden I'd carried many times before. We took off at 0800 hours, 14 C-46s loaded with the supplies that would keep China in the war. The takeoff from Chabua was always tricky. You had to use every inch of the runway to get airborne with a full load, and the humid air provided less lift than the thin atmosphere we'd encounter over the mountains. Iron Annie groaned under her burden, but lifted off cleanly, her twin Pratt and Whitney R2800 engines running smooth and strong. As we climbed toward our cruising altitude of 22,000 feet, the landscape below transformed from the green hell of the Assam jungle to the brown foothills that marked the beginning of the Himalayas. The mountains rose ahead of us like a wall of stone and ice, their peaks disappearing into a layer of clouds that promised trouble. "Radio check, Iron Annie." The voice of Lieutenant Bob Crawford, flying in position 2, crackled through my headphones. "Iron Annie to flight, radio check complete. We're climbing to 22,000. Stay tight, boys, it's going to get bumpy." The first hint of what was coming hit us at 18,000 feet. The aircraft suddenly dropped 50 feet, like we'd fallen through a trapdoor in the sky. My stomach jumped into my throat, and behind me, I heard one of the replacement pilots groan. The turbulence was beginning, and we hadn't even reached the mountains yet. "Pete, how are the engines?" I called to my flight engineer. "Running like Swiss watches, Captain. Oil pressure's good. Cylinder head temps are normal." That was the thing about the R2800 engines. They were reliable as sunrise, which was crucial when you were flying over terrain where a forced landing meant certain death. Each engine produced 2,000 horsepower, enough to keep us flying even if we lost one. At least, that's what the manual said. I was about to find out if it was true. The mountains rose up around us like the walls of a vast cathedral, their peaks shrouded in clouds that glowed with an eerie light. This was the domain of Mount Everest, K2, and a dozen other peaks that dwarfed anything in North America. The air was so thin that without our oxygen masks, we'd pass out in minutes. Even with supplemental oxygen, the cold was so intense that ice formed on the inside of the windscreen, whispered one of the replacement pilots, pressing his face to the window. "How high are those peaks?" "High enough to kill you if you're not careful," I replied. "The tallest ones top out at over 28,000 feet. We're threading the needle between them at 22,000, with about 1,000 feet of clearance if we're lucky." As if to punctuate my words, the aircraft hit another pocket of turbulence, this one so violent that it felt like a giant hand had grabbed us and shaken us like a rag doll. My charts scattered across the cockpit, and Pete had to grab the radio to keep it from flying loose. Behind us, our cargo shifted with a grinding noise that made my teeth ache. "Formation's holding together," reported Crawford, "but number 7 is falling behind." I looked back and saw Lieutenant Jerry Mason's C-46 struggling to maintain altitude. Black smoke was streaming from his left engine, never a good sign at 22,000 feet over the Himalayas. "Mason, what's your status?" I called over the radio. "Left engine's running rough, losing oil pressure. I'm going to try to nurse her home." My heart sank. Turning back meant flying alone over some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, with one engine and a heavy load. But pressing on with a sick engine was even more dangerous. "Negative, Mason. Turn back to Chabua. That's an order." "Roger, Iron Annie." "Good luck, boys." I watched as Mason's aircraft banked away from the formation, trailing smoke as it disappeared into the haze behind us. I never saw him again. 3 days later, we learned that he'd crashed into a mountainside 30 miles from Chabua, killing all aboard. We were 2 hours into the flight, navigating through a pass between 2 peaks that rose like monuments to some forgotten god, when Pete spotted them first. Aircraft, 2 o'clock high. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice water. 3 Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters were diving toward us out of the sun, their wings glinting as they rolled into attack position. The Oscars were fast, maneuverable, and deadly, everything our lumbering transports were not. "Japs," I shouted over the intercom. "All aircraft, evasive action." The formation scattered like startled birds. "ENA transport aircraft, there's no fighting back against fighters. Your only hope is to run, hide, or pray they're low on fuel." The C-46 wasn't built for aerobatics, but I threw Iron Annie into the steepest dive I dared, hoping to use the mountains for cover. The first Oscar opened fire, his wing-mounted machine guns stitching a line of holes across the wing of Crawford's aircraft. I saw pieces of aluminum spinning away in the slipstream, but somehow Bob kept flying. The second Oscar came after us, his guns winking as he closed the distance. "Hold on," I yelled, pulling Iron Annie into a climbing turn that made the airframe groan in protest. The Oscar flashed past our starboard wing, close enough that I could see the pilot's face behind his goggles. He was young, maybe 20, with a kind of determined expression that told me he'd follow us into hell itself. The third Oscar had found Lieutenant Charlie Davis, whose C-46 was laboring under a particularly heavy load. I watched in horror as the Japanese fighter made pass after pass, each attack tearing chunks out of Davis's aircraft. Finally, smoke began streaming from the right engine, and Davis's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm hit bad, boys." Going down. The Oscar pulled up for another attack, but Davis was already dropping toward a snow-covered valley below. At the last second, I saw parachutes, 2, 3, 4 of them floating down toward the unforgiving landscape. The C-46 hit the mountainside and exploded in a ball of orange flame that echoed off the peaks like thunder. "Bastards!" Pete snarled, but there was nothing we could do. The Oscars were already climbing back toward their base, probably low on fuel and ammunition. In the space of 5 minutes, they'd cost us 2 aircraft and 8 men. The remaining aircraft regrouped, but the formation was ragged now, spread out across several miles of hostile sky. We'd learned to expect Japanese fighters over the northern route. They'd established bases in Burma and were trying to cut our supply in China. But seeing them in action, watching good men die, never got easier. We pressed on toward China, flying through passes that seemed barely wider than our wingspan. The peaks rose around us like sleeping giants, their slopes covered with snow and ice that had never felt the warmth of the sun. This was the roof of the world, a place where the air was so thin that our engines gasped for breath and our own lungs burned despite the oxygen masks. The turbulence was constant now, slamming us up and down like a roller coaster designed by a madman. One moment we'd be climbing at 2,000 feet per minute. The next we'd be dropping so fast that loose objects floated in the cabin. The replacement pilots were all airsick, their faces green behind their oxygen masks. "How much farther?" One of them gasped. "Another hour to Kunming," I replied, fighting to keep Iron Annie level as we hit another pocket of rough air. "Assuming we don't run into any more trouble." As if God had a sense of humor, it was at that exact moment that the left engine began to cough. At first, I thought it was just the thin air affecting the carburetor. The R-2800 engines were fuel-hungry beasts, and at altitude, they had to work harder to get the air-fuel mixture right. But the coughing got worse, accompanied by a vibration that I could feel through the control yoke. "Pete, check the left engine readings." My flight engineer was already scanning the gauges, his face grim behind his oxygen mask. "Oil pressure's dropping, Captain. Cylinder head temp is climbing." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Engine problems over the Himalayas were every pilot's nightmare. There were no emergency landing fields, no flat ground, no rescue teams. If you went down in these mountains, the only question was whether you die from the crash or freeze to death first. The engine coughed again, harder this time, and I saw black smoke beginning to stream from the cowling. We were at 21,000 feet, surrounded by peaks that rose to 24,000, with 90 miles still to go to reach the safety of Chinese airspace. Feather the left prop, I ordered Pete. We're going to have to fly on one engine. Feathering the propeller meant turning the blade's edge onto the wind, reducing drag, but also eliminating any chance of restarting the engine. It was a one-way decision, and once made, we'd be committed to reaching Kunming on a singular 2,800. The vibration stopped as the left propeller feathered, but now we were flying a 20-ton aircraft on half power. Iron Annie began to lose altitude, the nose dropping despite my efforts to keep her level. The remaining engine was running at full power, its exhaust glowing cherry red in the thin air. Can we make it? Pete asked, his voice tight with concern. I did the calculations in my head, our current altitude, rate of descent, distance to Kunming, and the height of the mountains ahead. It was going to be close. Very close. We're going to try, I said, adjusting our course toward the lowest pass I could find. Dump the cargo. It was a painful decision. The supplies we were carrying were desperately needed by the Chinese forces and the American airmen fighting in China. Every bullet, every radio, every medical kit could save lives. But it wouldn't matter if we didn't make it there alive. Pete and the replacement pilots began pushing cargo out of the rear door, cases of ammunition, boxes of medicine, precious radio equipment. Each item that tumbled into the void below lightened our load and bought us a few more miles of flying time. With the cargo gone, Iron Annie flew better on one engine, but we were still losing altitude faster than I liked. The peaks around us seemed to grow taller as we descended, their snow-covered summits reaching toward us like grasping fingers. The pass ahead was our only hope, a narrow valley between two 23,000-foot peaks that would take us into Chinese airspace. Altitude? I called to Pete. 19,500 and falling. Rate of descent is 300 feet per minute. I did the math again. At our current rate of descent, we'd be at 18,000 feet when we reached the pass. The problem was, the pass was at 18,500 feet. We were going to be 500 feet short, which in aviation terms meant we were going to die very messily against the mountainside. All right, boys, I said over the intercom, trying to keep my voice steady. It's going to be close. If anyone's got any prayers, now would be a good time to use them. The mountains loomed ahead of us, their peaks disappearing into a layer of clouds that promised even more trouble. The single engine was running at maximum power, its exhaust temperature redlined, but it was all we had. Behind us, the other C-46s in our formation were climbing to clear the pass, their twin engines giving them an advantage we no longer possessed. Iron Annie, this is Crawford. Do you need assistance? Negative, Bob. Just clear the pass and tell Kunming we're coming in short on fuel and power. Roger. Good luck, Jake. The pass was a knife edge of rock and ice, barely half a mile wide, with vertical walls that rose into the clouds. As we approached, I could see ice crystals forming on the windscreen, and the temperature gauge showed -40 degrees Fahrenheit. At this altitude and temperature, if we went down, we'd freeze to death long before any rescue team could reach us. 18,000 feet, Pete called out. We're not going to make it. But sometimes, when you're flying on a prayer and running on empty, the mountains take pity on you. A thermal updraft, generated by the sun hitting the rocky slopes below, caught Iron Annie and lifted her just enough to clear the pass. We shot through the gap with maybe 50 feet to spare, the wingtips almost brushing the ice-covered walls. We made it. One of the replacement pilots shouted, but I knew we weren't out of trouble yet. We were over Chinese territory now, but we still had to reach Kunming with a failing engine and dangerously low fuel. The eastern slopes of the Himalayas fell away beneath us as we flew deeper into China, but our problems were far from over. The single engine was showing signs of stress, oil temperature climbing, fuel consumption higher than normal, exhaust glowing white hot. We were asking too much of it, but we had no choice. Kunming Tower, this is Iron Annie. We're declaring an emergency. Single engine failure, low on fuel, requesting priority landing. The reply came back in accented English. Chinese ground control had been trained by American personnel, but communication was always a challenge. Iron Annie, Kunming Tower. You are cleared for emergency approach. Fire truck standing by. Below us, the landscape was changing from the stark peaks of the Himalayas to the brown hills and terraced fields of southern China. It was a beautiful sight, but I couldn't enjoy it while nursing a sick airplane through hostile skies. Japanese fighters operated out of bases in occupied China, and alone, damaged transport would be an easy target. Altitude? I asked Pete. 14,000 and still dropping. We've got about 30 minutes of fuel left. 30 minutes. In a healthy aircraft, that would be plenty to reach Kunming. But we weren't in a healthy aircraft. We were in a damaged bird with one engine and prayers for wings. The mountains were behind us now, replaced by the rolling hills that surrounded Kunming. I could see the airfield in the distance, its runways carved out of the red earth like scars on the landscape. Smoke was rising from several points around the city, evidence of Japanese bombing raids that hit regularly. There she is, Pete said, pointing toward the airfield. Looks like home to me. But even as he spoke, the remaining engine began to run rough. The RPM gauge flickered, the oil pressure dropped, and a new vibration shook the airframe. We were losing our last engine, and we were still 10 miles from the field. Mayday, 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 I called over the radio. Iron Annie has lost both engines. We're going down 10 miles southwest of Kunming. The radio crackled with concerned voices, but there was nothing anyone could do. We were gliding now, a 20-ton piece of aluminum falling toward Chinese countryside with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. The airspeed indicator showed 140 miles per hour, fast enough to kill everyone aboard if we hit anything solid. I looked down at the terrain below, searching for anything that resembled a landing field. Rice paddies stretched to the horizon, broken by small villages and irrigation canals. None of it looked particularly inviting for a forced landing, but we didn't have a choice. Everyone hold on, I shouted over the intercom. We're going in hard. I picked a rice paddy that looked slightly longer than the others and pointed Iron Annie's nose toward it. The ground was coming up fast now, the individual plants in the paddies clearly visible. I could see farmers working in the fields, stopping to stare at the big American aircraft falling out of the sky. Landing gear? Pete asked. Negative. Gear up. We'll belly in. Putting the landing gear down would give us better control during the landing, but it would also dig into the soft ground and flip us over. Better to slide in on the belly and hope the mud would slow us down before we hit anything solid. The rice paddy rushed up to meet us. At the last second, I pulled back on the yoke, raising the nose to bleed off speed. Iron Annie hit the water and mud with a tremendous splash, throwing up a wall of dirty water on both sides. The aircraft skidded across the paddy like a giant surfboard, the aluminum belly screaming as it scraped against rocks and debris. We were sliding sideways now, the tail swinging around as we lost directional control. I could see an irrigation dike ahead of us, and I knew that if we hit it, the impact would break the aircraft in half. But there was nothing I could do except hold on and pray. The left wing hit the dike first, crumpling like paper and spinning us around. The cockpit filled with the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass. Something hit me in the head, and for a moment, everything went black. I came to with Pete shaking my shoulder, his face covered with blood from a cut on his forehead. The cockpit was tilted at a crazy angle, and I could smell aviation fuel mixed with the earthy scent of the rice paddy. Captain, are you all right? I tried to move and discovered that my left shoulder was dislocated, probably from the impact with the control yoke. But I was alive, and that was more than I'd expected a few minutes ago. The passengers? I asked, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. All alive. Banged up pretty good, but alive. I looked back through the cabin and saw the three replacement pilots helping each other out of their seats. One had a broken arm, another was bleeding from a head wound, but they were moving under their own power. It was a miracle, 20 tons of aircraft hitting the ground at over 100 miles per hour, and we'd all survived. The sound of voices outside told us that the local farmers had reached the crash site. Through the broken windscreen, I could see Chinese faces peering at us with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They were chattering rapidly in a dialect I couldn't understand, but their intentions seemed friendly. "American! American!" One of them called out in broken English. "You okay?" "We're okay," I called back, though I wasn't sure how true that was. We were alive, but we were also stranded in the middle of rural China, hundreds of miles from the nearest American base, with a war going on around us. Pete had managed to get the radio working, powered by the aircraft's battery. "Kunming Tower, this is Iron Annie. We're down but alive. Request immediate rescue. Iron Annie, Kunming Tower. Rescue helicopters are en route. Maintain your position. Helicopters." In 1944, they were still experimental aircraft, used mainly for search and rescue in areas where conventional aircraft couldn't land. The fact that they were sending helicopters told me that our location was too dangerous for a normal rescue operation. The Chinese farmers had organized themselves into a rescue party, bringing ropes and improvised stretchers. They spoke no English, and we spoke no Chinese, but the universal language of people helping people transcended all barriers. They helped us out of the wreckage and carried the wounded to higher ground, away from the aviation fuel that was leaking from Iron Annie's ruptured tanks. The rescue helicopters arrived 2 hours later, strange, insect-like machines that landed in clouds of dust and noise. The pilots were Americans, members of the 1st Air Commando group that had been formed for special operations in the China-Burma-India theater. "You boys sure know how to pick a landing spot," the helicopter pilot said as he helped load the wounded. "We've been looking for you all over southern China." As we lifted off from the rice paddy, I looked down at the wreckage of Iron Annie. She'd carried us over the most dangerous mountains on Earth, fought off Japanese fighters, and brought us safely to the ground when her engines failed. Now she was just twisted metal and broken dreams, slowly sinking into the mud of a Chinese rice paddy. The flight to Kunming took 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. My shoulder was throbbing, and I couldn't stop thinking about the men we'd lost. Davis and his crew, shot down by Japanese fighters, and Mason, who tried to nurse a sick engine home and paid for it with his life. In one mission, we'd lost 2 aircraft and 8 men, all for a load of supplies that was now scattered across the Himalayas. At Kunming, the base hospital patched us up and gave us clean clothes. The replacement pilots were shaken, but determined to continue their mission. They'd seen what flying in China was like, and they were ready for whatever came next. As for me, I had a decision to make. My shoulder would heal, but the doctors weren't sure if I'd ever regain full mobility. My flying career might be over. Major Henderson visited me in the hospital that evening, bringing news from the squadron. "We lost 2 more aircraft today," he said quietly. "Engine failure and weather. This is eating us alive, Jake." I knew the statistics as well as he did. Since the Hump airlift had begun in 1942, we'd flown over 150,000 tons of supplies to China, but at a terrible cost. Over 600 aircraft lost, more than 1,600 men dead or missing. For every ton of supplies that reached China, we'd paid with blood and aluminum. The war's turning, though, Henderson continued. MacArthur's island hopping campaign is working. The Japanese are being pushed back across the Pacific. Sooner or later, they'll have to surrender. But that didn't bring back the men we'd lost or make the mountains any less dangerous. The Hump would continue to claim aircraft and crews until the war ended, the aerial highway paved with the wreckage of American dreams. 3 weeks later, I was declared fit for limited duty and assigned to train new pilots for Hump operations. My shoulder never did heal properly. To this day, I can't raise my left arm above my head without pain. But I considered myself lucky. I'd flown 73 missions over the most dangerous route in the world and lived to tell about it. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945 with the surrender of Japan after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hump airlift was shut down, its mission accomplished. We'd kept China in the war, supplied the Flying Tigers, and proven that American ingenuity and courage could overcome any obstacle. But victory came at a price that's hard to calculate. The official records show that 594 aircraft were lost flying the Hump, along with 1,659 aircrew members. Those are just numbers on a page, but each one represents a story. A young man who left home to serve his country and never came back, a family that waited for news that never came, a future that was cut short by war. I think about those men often, especially during the quiet hours before dawn when the world is still and memories have a way of creeping back. I think about Charlie Davis, shot down by Japanese fighters while defending a formation of unarmed transports. I think about Jerry Mason, trying to nurse a sick engine home and dying in the attempt. I think about all the crews who flew into the mountains and never came out. The Himalayas are still there, of course, as dangerous and unforgiving as ever. But they're quiet now, no longer echoing with the sound of American engines fighting for altitude in the thin air. The wreckage of our aircraft is still scattered across those peaks, monuments to courage and sacrifice that few will ever see. Sometimes, when I'm giving a lecture to young pilots, they ask me what it was like flying the Hump. How do you explain what it felt like to pilot a 20-ton aircraft through mountain passes in weather that could tear your wings off? How do you describe the loneliness of flying alone over terrain where a forced landing meant certain death? How do you put into words the terror and exhilaration of dancing with death at 20,000 feet? The truth is, you can't. You can tell the stories, recite the statistics, show them photographs of the mountains and the aircraft. But you can't make them understand the weight of responsibility that came with every takeoff, knowing that your decisions would determine whether your crew lived or died. You can't make them feel the bone-deep cold of flying at altitude in an unheated aircraft, or the gut-wrenching fear of watching a friend's plane disappear into a mountainside. What I can tell them is this: we did our job. We flew the supplies that kept China in the war, and in doing so, we tied up Japanese resources that might otherwise have been used against MacArthur's forces in the Pacific. We proved that American pilots could fly anywhere, under any conditions, and get the job done. The cost was high, higher than any of us imagined when we first saw those mountains rising like a wall across our path. But freedom has always come at a price, and someone has to pay it. In World War II, that someone was often a young American pilot, flying alone over hostile territory with nothing but courage and determination to see him through. We were ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things, and somehow we found the strength to answer the call. The Hump claimed many good men, but it didn't claim their spirit. That lives on in every pilot who pushes through dangerous weather to deliver supplies to those who need them, in every aircrew that risks their lives to serve their country, in every American who refuses to give up when the odds are against them. Iron Annie is gone, rusting away in a Chinese rice paddy, but her legacy lives on. She carried us over the roof of the world and brought us safely home when her engines failed. She was a good bird, and she deserved better than to die in a muddy field so far from home. As for me, I survived the war and lived to see my country triumph over fascism in both Europe and the Pacific. I married my sweetheart, raised a family, and had a career in commercial aviation. But part of me never left those mountains. Part of me is still there, flying through the thin air at 20,000 feet, nursing a sick engine toward the safety of Chinese airspace. The Hump was the most dangerous route in World War II, but it was also the most necessary. Without it, China would have fallen to the Japanese, and the war in the Pacific might have lasted years longer. The men who flew it, the ones who made it home, and the ones who didn't, were heroes in the truest sense of the word. They answered their country's call when freedom hung in the balance, and they paid whatever price was asked of them. Some paid with their lives, others with their health, and all of them with a piece of their souls. But they got the job done, and in the end, that's what mattered. The mountains remember them, even if the world has forgotten. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right through those high passes, you can still hear the sound of American engines carrying freedom on their wings over the top of the world. That's what it means to fly the hump. That's what it means to serve your country when the stakes are life and death, and the margin for error is measured in feet rather than miles. We were young men who grew old before our time, but we were Americans, and we got the job done. The Japanese thought the Himalayas would stop us. They were wrong. Nothing could stop us, not the weather, not the mountains, not the enemy fighters. We were Americans, and we had a job to do. We flew the hump because someone had to. We paid the price because freedom demanded it. And we'd do it again tomorrow if our country called. That's the legacy of the hump, not just the tonnage delivered or the strategic objectives achieved, but the proof that American courage and determination can overcome any obstacle. The mountains may be eternal, but so is the American spirit. And as long as that spirit endures, no mountain will be too high, no mission too dangerous, no sacrifice too great for those who serve under the flag of freedom. In the end, that's what we fought for, not just victory in a war, but the preservation of the ideals that make America great. The right to be free, to speak our minds, to worship as we choose, to raise our families in peace. Those rights don't come free. They're paid for with the blood and sacrifice of those willing to defend them. The men who flew the hump understood that. They knew the risks, accepted the dangers, and flew anyway because their country needed them. Some came home, some didn't, but all of them served with honor and distinction. They were the best of America, and they deserved better than to be forgotten by history. So remember them, remember the pilots, the engineers, the radio operators, the cargo handlers, and all the others who made the hump airlift possible. Remember their courage, their sacrifice, and their unwavering commitment to duty. And remember that freedom isn't free. It's bought and paid for by heroes who answer the call when their country needs them most. The hump is history now, but its lessons endure. Courage in the face of danger. Determination in the face of impossible odds. Sacrifice in the service of something greater than oneself. These are the values that built America, and they're the values that will preserve it for future generations. As long as there are Americans willing to fly into the teeth of danger to serve their country, the spirit of the hump will live on. And the mountains will remember.